Reagan Tokes, a 22-year-old college student full of dreams and ambition, never imagined her ordinary night leaving work would end in tragedy. What began as a routine drive home quickly spiraled into one of the most chilling crimes the community had ever seen. Behind her disappearance lay a predator who had been waiting, watching, and planning his move. This is the story of how a promising future was stolen, and how investigators uncovered the horrifying truth. Reagan Tokes was a 22-year-old college student whose life seemed to be on a path filled with promise. She was studying psychology, fascinated by how the human mind worked, and she often dreamed of one day using her degree to help people who had gone through difficult experiences. Those who knew her described her as kind and driven, someone who could walk into a room and make everyone feel noticed. She had a way of balancing her academics with her personal life, never letting stress overshadow her warmth. Reagan also worked part-time at a cafe not far from her campus. Customers often remembered her smile, her patience, and the quiet determination in her eyes. She wasn't just working for extra money. She was proving to herself that she could handle responsibility while building her future. Outside of school and work, Reagan's life was filled with ordinary joys. She loved spending time with friends, whether that meant late-night study sessions, quick coffee runs, or simply walking around campus talking about their dreams. Her family was incredibly proud of her achievements, especially because she had always been the one to set high goals and push herself to reach them. To them, Reagan wasn't just a daughter or a sister. She was a source of inspiration. Her future looked bright, full of opportunities that many believed she would grab with both hands. But behind this picture of normalcy and promise, the world around her carried dangers that no one wanted to imagine. While Reagan focused on her studies and the future she hoped to build, fate was already shifting in the shadows. A single night would be enough to tear apart everything she had worked for, turning her name into the center of a story far darker than anyone could have foreseen. On the night of her disappearance, Reagan left work later than usual. The cafe had been busy, and she stayed behind to help close. The streets were quiet when she walked out to the parking lot, her breath visible in the cold February air. She unlocked her car, got in, and sent a quick text to a friend letting them know she was heading home. It was the kind of routine she had done many times before, yet this night would be different. Somewhere along the way, her path was interrupted by someone who had been waiting for the right moment. What happened next would remain unclear until investigators began piecing it together, but one fact was certain. Reagan never made it home. By the following morning, concern began to grow. Her parents tried calling, but the phone rang without an answer. Friends checked with each other, realizing no one had heard from her since the night before. When Reagan missed an important class and a meeting she had promised to attend, the alarm became impossible to ignore. Reports were made, and police quickly became involved. The urgency was heightened by the fact that her car was discovered abandoned near a park just a few miles from where she worked. The doors were locked, but her belongings weren't inside, leaving more questions than answers. Search teams combed the area, volunteers joined in, and posters began circulating. The community, shaken and fearful, clung to hope that Reagan might still be alive. Yet with every hour that passed, that hope seemed to fade. The image of her car sitting alone by the park lingered in everyone's minds. It stood as a chilling reminder that something had gone terribly wrong in the hours after she left work. The question now was where Reagan had gone and who had taken her. 2 days after Reagan vanished, the search ended in a devastating discovery. A group of investigators combing through a wooded area on the outskirts of town came across what they had feared most. Hidden among the trees, they found Reagan's body. The scene was grim, and the silence of the forest only deepened the weight of what had happened. The young woman who had been full of life, dreams, and ambition had been brutally taken away. The evidence told a disturbing story. Marks on her clothing and injuries on her body revealed she had not simply been killed, but had likely been held against her will before her final moments. Investigators quickly realized this was no chance encounter. Whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to control and harm her. The details were so horrific that even the most seasoned detectives struggled with what they were seeing. It was clear that Reagan had been targeted, and that her final hours had been filled with unimaginable fear. The news spread quickly, and the town fell into shock. Candlelight vigils were organized almost immediately, as friends, classmates, and strangers gathered to grieve. Reagan's family, heartbroken and shattered, faced a nightmare that no one could prepare for. Their daughter's life, once filled with promise, had been stolen in the cruelest way possible. For investigators, the discovery shifted everything. What had started as a missing person case was now a homicide investigation. The urgency intensified as police began retracing Reagan's final steps, determined to find who was behind the crime. The wooded area, once a quiet escape for hikers and dog walkers, was now sealed off with crime scene tape, a grim reminder that evil had passed through. The search for answers had only just begun, and the truth waiting to surface would be even darker than anyone expected. As detectives dug deeper into Reagan's final hours, the investigation began to reveal disturbing connections. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed her car leaving the cafe parking lot. But what caught investigators' attention was a shadowy figure captured in the background of the footage. He seemed to linger near the lot, moving toward the direction of her car shortly after she drove away. Police enhanced the video and began circulating the image internally. It wasn't long before a name surfaced. A man with a violent criminal record who had recently been released from prison. The suspect had a long history of assaults, robberies, and threats, and though he was out on parole, he had already been evading his required check-ins. Officers discovered he had been staying in a rundown apartment not far from the park where Reagan's car had been found. Neighbors described him as strange and unpredictable, someone who often wandered the streets at odd hours. The proximity to Reagan's last known location raised alarm bells. Detectives began to piece together his timeline on the night she disappeared. Witnesses recalled seeing a man matching his description walking near the cafe. Others remembered a car similar to his circling the neighborhood late into the night. When police questioned him, his answers were inconsistent, and he seemed nervous. His alibis didn't match up, and his phone records were vague, filled with gaps he couldn't explain. For investigators, the picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't a random act of violence. Reagan had crossed paths with someone who had been searching for an opportunity. The man's history and behavior pointed toward a dangerous pattern, a predator blending into the community while hiding a dark secret. What had seemed like a mystery was now narrowing in on one figure, and police were determined to expose what he had done. Technology soon became the key that unlocked the truth behind Reagan's murder. Investigators obtained a warrant for the suspect's phone records, and what they uncovered was chilling. GPS data revealed his movements on the night she disappeared. The coordinates placed him near the cafe just before Reagan left work, then at the park where her car was later found, and finally in the wooded area where her body was discovered. The digital trail left little room for doubt. He had been with her from the moment she vanished. Detectives also examined surveillance cameras from gas stations and intersections along his route. In one clip, his car could be seen following a vehicle that matched Reagan's. In another, his car reappeared hours later, heading toward his apartment. When investigators searched his residence, the evidence was undeniable. Inside, they found gloves and rope tucked away in a drawer. More disturbing was the discovery of DNA that matched Reagan's, confirming she had been there at some point. The apartment itself was unsettling. It was dark and sparse, with windows covered by heavy curtains. On the table sat a laptop with internet searches about restraining techniques and how to avoid police detection. Every detail pointed toward a premeditated plan. The items recovered painted a picture of someone who had been preparing for an attack long before Reagan crossed his path. As the evidence piled up, investigators knew they were closing in on him. Each discovery strengthened the case, transforming suspicion into certainty. What began as an unclear puzzle was now fitting together piece by piece, and the image it formed was terrifying. Reagan had not been the victim of chance. She had been caught in the carefully executed plan of a man who believed he could outsmart everyone. But his mistakes, buried in technology and forensic evidence, were finally catching up to him. The deeper investigators looked, the more sinister the suspect's motives became. Through interviews and records, They learned he had been watching young women in the area for weeks, following their routines and studying their habits. Social media activity revealed he had been scrolling through profiles late at night, bookmarking pictures and keeping track of schedules that were never meant to be public. Reagan's face appeared in his search history more than once, suggesting she had been singled out long before that February night. Detectives pieced together that his goal was never quick violence. He wanted control, power, and the ability to dominate. His past crimes echoed the same pattern: threats, intimidation, and attempts to trap women who crossed his path. What made Reagan different was that she became the victim of a carefully planned escalation. He had prepared his apartment as a place to hold someone, gathering tools that pointed not to robbery, but to captivity. The ropes, gloves, and the chilling internet searches left no doubt about his intentions. Psychologists brought in to analyze the case described him as someone who thrived on fear. He wasn't driven by need or desperation, but by the satisfaction of overpowering others. Investigators now understood that Reagan's murder was the culmination of a fantasy he had been building for years. Her bright future, her independence, and her strength were everything he wanted to crush. The revelations horrified the community. Parents warned their daughters to stay cautious, and the once safe neighborhoods now felt shadowed by the idea that someone like him had been walking freely among them. For Reagan's family, each new detail was another wound, proof of just how calculated the crime had been. The story was no longer about a tragic loss alone. It was about a predator who had spent months preparing for the moment he chose to strike. The arrest came swiftly once the evidence was undeniable. Police surrounded the suspect's apartment in the early hours of the morning, catching him before he could escape. Inside, officers found him calm but uncooperative, as if he believed he could still manipulate his way out of the situation. But the mountain of evidence left no room for denial. He was charged with Reagan's murder, and the trial that followed became one of the most closely watched cases the community had ever seen. In court, prosecutors presented the disturbing trail of evidence: the GPS records, the surveillance footage, the DNA found in his apartment, and the chilling internet searches that revealed his dark intentions. The jury listened in silence as Reagan's final hours were described in detail. Her family sat through every moment, their grief visible but their resolve unshaken. They wanted justice, and they were determined to see it through to the end. The defense tried to argue for doubt, suggesting gaps in the timeline and questioning the reliability of the digital evidence. But the weight of facts was too strong. Witnesses testified about his behavior in the days leading up to the murder, and experts explained how his actions fit the pattern of a predator who had planned carefully. Each day of testimony stripped away another layer of his defense until the truth was impossible to ignore. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Reagan's family, the decision brought justice but not peace. Their daughter's life had been stolen, her dreams cut short by someone who thrived on cruelty. Yet her story sparked change. Safety programs were strengthened on campuses, laws were re-examined, and her name became a symbol of resilience. Reagan's light, though stolen, continued to guide others, reminding the world that her life was more than the way it ended.